I was out having a little coffee early this morning with my 23-year-old daughter. So she's in the middle of my three kids. And we very unexpectedly both had a little cry. I started first about, we were reflecting on my mother who had passed away 4 years ago. She was diagnosed with cancer this month, 4 years ago. And yeah, I just felt very overwhelmed. And the realization that, which I've had many times, but this has become very apparent this morning, the realization around being the next generation, I guess. That I don't have parents anymore, and now it's like I'm the one getting older, and it'll be my children facing that next. And then she held space for me while I very unexpectedly had deep emotions in a coffee shop at about 7 o'clock this morning. But anyway, yeah, and then I guess that opened up the safety place. We started talking about some other things, and that, she's just come back from overseas and left some dear friends in another country, and that's opened up some emotions for her too. Interesting how when you're sitting in a safe space that you can speak and reveal your emotions, and sometimes they don't give you much choice, they come up for you. I just wanted to talk to you about, I'm a Gen X woman, so many of you on this channel who follow me, and maybe those that haven't subscribed but still have a listen to some of the videos sometimes, would be of similar vintage. And I just wanted to have this conversation today because I guess I'm curious to know, have you noticed the same sort of thing? Once women reach this age and, we reach our 50s, it's a very interesting time because I'm lucky I've got daughters and a son who's open to lots of conversations, but that's certainly not everyone's case. But the conversations do start to change, and we're often told to focus on our limitations as Gen Xers, and I find that there is a lot of that on social medias, talking about the limitations that what we have in this age group, and I don't even need to refer it to Gen Xers, but I just think potentially people mid 40s and onwards, particularly in the 50s and 60s, the limitations around age and hormones and menopause and these bodies that are changing. I've been on a weight loss journey for about 18 months now, and I have lost a considerable amount of weight through changing a lot of things, but it doesn't really change the body. Like the body still, you've got to still work on the body, on the strength, and while your size of clothes changes, unless you sort of work on here what happens in your mind too, sometimes you can just end with a deflated bag and a body that weighs less, but still you're not happy with. So we do focus on those things a bit. Sometimes we've got to really address that, how much we have left in the workforce. And again, many of you, if you've followed me, I left a very long career about 3 years ago now, and that really changes who you are as well. We focus on whether you're becoming invisible, and while those conversations are important, and I believe they are, there is a place for them. But there is something that's really missing in this conversation. I would like to address that today, and it's around, I think we're just forgetting about really talking about what we have done and what we do need to focus on and what we feel really good about. Because when I look around at the women in my life, I don't see a generation that's fading away at all. I find I work with women in my Grounded Women circle. I don't find women that are fading away. Perhaps women join my membership, my group, because they feel that way. But once they feel empowered, they absolutely know that they're not. And what I do see though is one of the most resilient and adaptable and capable generations of women that I've ever seen. And I think that it's time that we really acknowledge that. And if we look back at our grandparents and parents, that we'll see that, our generation is very capable, very resilient, very reliable. I really love that about us. I think it's time to acknowledge it. Because let's face it, we were raised in this. It's funny looking back and talking to the kids about it, or other ladies my age. We were raised in a world that it's kind of unrecognizable now. Do you remember when you first got a TV? I remember sitting in front of the black and white TV and having those games that we had on there, and it was like tennis, and you just go ping, 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 ping. And that entertained us for ages. And not little did we ever know of the technology that we'd be dealing with today. How different and how quickly it has evolved today. It didn't evolve quickly then, I don't think. We were raised in a world that looks really unrecognizable, I reckon. And we didn't have mobile phones, we didn't have social media or Google. I remember doing assignments and with work with school and having to look through encyclopedias, and I was so happy that my mum and dad invested in encyclopedias from that traveling salesperson that knocked on your door, and then it was a big investment. They had to pay it off. We had this great bookcase full of encyclopedias, and I would go pour through the pages because I loved it. And I loved looking at countries and different things, rainforests, and just beautiful things in the libraries. In our home library, it was so amazing. Before mobile phones, and your parents would trust that you could go out on the bike all day and say, just be home before dark, for dinner. And there was so much trust that we could do that. Sometimes you'd come home with skin off you because you'd come off your bike, but you didn't care. You just got on with it. We didn't have online shopping, which is probably a good thing because we didn't have the money to spend on it. We didn't have emails. If we wanted to speak to someone, we had to have a phone with, I remember having a long cord on the phone and closing the door and sitting in the hallway. It was fun times. We'd had maps and phone books, and, we had to go to the library at school or the library in town if we wanted more information or research for a project that we were doing. Somehow though we became this generation, I guess, that, we successfully have bridged these worlds, haven't we? Maybe our children have helped do that too. I've got 3 kids and they're of different generations, and they're different too. They've got different worlds. A life before technology. Do you remember how, if you text on your phone, do you remember how that you learnt to text? I remember my son, who's now nearly a dad himself and he's nearly 36. I remember he had a mobile phone, and I got my first mobile phone, and I said, can you please help me teach me how to text? Because I would receive texts from him and I had no idea how to respond. And so my first texts were yes or no. And I was happy with that because he would ask questions and it would be a yes or a no. How clear is that? Black and white. Nothing's black and white now. We've learnt to live with it though. And then I guess probably 6 or 12 months later, he'd be saying like, Mom, you're sending me a thesis. Just a yes or no will be fine. Because we get confident and we get practiced, don't we? Back in the day, we entered workforces that were still changing. My first role, I guess, not my first job, but when I first started my career in the medical profession, I actually joined the Royal Australian Navy and I was a medic. I started that when I was 19. I went there the day after I turned 19. Oh boy, got a rude awakening back in those days in the 80s. But many of us, when we started to work, things looked really differently back then. I got paid cash. We used to line up and salute, and they'd hand us, a cash, and which was pretty well paid back in those days. The opportunities were starting to expand. I think it changed very much when I joined my career as a paramedic. Of course, that it took many years to get into that role after the Navy, because they weren't employing women, which is quite extraordinary, isn't it? It took me about 5 or 6 years to get in, but eventually I did. I persevered and I got in there. And still, there's no doubt there's still a long way to go, but we were leaders. We led, we persevered, we were committed. Many of us walked into workplaces and where leadership positions were dominated by men, and they weren't known as leadership positions really. They were known as management, and they certainly were dominated by men back in the day. Flexible work arrangements were rare. I remember when I had my 2 daughters, when I was in ambulance, there were no such thing as flexible work arrangements. When I went back, you had to be part-time, 20 hours, or full-time, or not at all, and then you lost your job. Things have changed significantly. Conversations about mental health rarely existed, which was a really bad part of the work that I was in. We might have had a conversation about a bad job with a colleague on the way back or around the rec room table. What welfare was unusual. And I guess today that has rubbed off a little bit. Menopause wasn't discussed. And while my menopause journey was much later in my career, it certainly wasn't something that was discussed at all over that time, and burnout wasn't a thing. It was there. We didn't recognize it, but it wasn't a thing. I think burnout really started to come into conversations around COVID. May have been before that, but it's sort of in my mind. I was in emergency management in COVID, and certainly burnout after that was certainly a big topic. The emotional load that women carried wasn't discussed either, and there were very few women in my career, to be honest. There were probably more in the military than in ambulance. There were very few women, but the women that were in were capable and strong, and they showed up all the time. Some were parents, some were not, but day after day, we all showed up all the time. We built careers, but even outside of that, women starting businesses, Gen X women, they lead teams. Women support communities, and they teach kids and care for parents and patients. And it's easy to forget, and it's easy to not appreciate where we've been and how we feel today. Women quietly help to reshape what is possible for women today and for the women that followed us. And I don't want you to ever forget that. It's interesting that when I look back, and whoever thought that we would be the generation that really paved the way and carried other people through. A lot of people started relying on Gen X people in general, men and women. And it's easy to forget how much you're carrying in that 40s, 50s, 60s, and it can be a considerable amount. And I guess we just do it because that's what we've always done. But the reality is we need to change things. We learnt to adapt. And not about you, but I've adapted so much, so many times. We think about how many times we've had to reinvent ourselves. I guess getting ready for now, because I never really knew what life in my late 50s towards my 60s was ever going to look like. And in fact, it's much different than I ever believed it would be. Some have survived divorce. I have. Many of us have cared for or palliated sick parents. Had to make the decision whether they go into a nursing home or whether you look after them. We've buried people that we loved. I was talking to my daughter the other day, and a song came on, and it was Cyndi Lauper, Time After Time. And I remember as a young woman in my 20s going to a funeral of a very dear friend, Belinda, who passed away from brain cancer. And that every time now that song comes up, I remember her. It's a trigger and an anchor that promotes, I guess, in the early years, sadness, and provokes thought that what might she have become all these years later if she would be about 60 now, and she never got to even hit that, she never got to have children or be 30s and 40s and 50s, and she never got to go through menopause or marry or do anything like that, and makes you ponder. I guess many of us have lost a lot of friends over the years, and I think Belinda was the beginning for me. Sometimes we lose babies and children and pregnancies, and that can be quite heartbreaking. We have started over financially, and that's a hard one to take. Sometimes at this age we've faced redundancy, unexpected illnesses, and we've watched out for friends that are unwell as well. Sometimes we have watched our life unfold very differently than we would ever have imagined it would have in our 20s. And I must admit that in my 20s, as a young mum, I had no idea what was around the corner. I had no idea. Gen Xers, we just do what needs to be done. We just raise kids, pay mortgages, build careers, show up, help neighbours, volunteer, do the sports, be out in that oval at 8 o'clock in the morning, hold everything together. Many women and men watching this, they won't see themselves as extraordinary, but I do, because I know that many of us have carried many of these things, and I know how quietly you've carried it. So I want you to have a new perspective on life, on midlife. Is it midlife if you're in your late 50s? Ask yourself, what if life isn't becoming less? Like, what if it's finally just recognizing who you've become? What if these wrinkles aren't about evidence of decline? Like, what if they're about evidence of a life fully lived? What if your wisdom that you've gained is one of your greatest assets? Not your home, not your bank account, but your wisdom. So ask yourself this question: what if this stage of life isn't asking you to become someone new? You don't have to do that. What if it's asking you to finally acknowledge the beautiful, wonderful person or woman that you've already become? And I shall leave you with that. And I hope to see you in my next video.